ex-wife shows up at billionaire CEO's Halloween party, with twins who look exactly like him. "Who are these children?" Thomas Anderson demanded, his voice cutting through the elegant Halloween music as he stared at the two small faces revealed beneath their masks. "And why do they look exactly like me?" The grand ballroom fell silent, hundreds of costumed guests freezing mid-conversation to witness the unfolding drama. Emily Harris stood her ground, one hand on each child's shoulder as she faced the billionaire CEO whose world was about to shatter. "They're your children, Thomas?" she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Ethan and Emma. They're 4 years old." Thomas staggered back as though physically struck, his vampire cape swirling around him. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his eyes betrayed him as they darted between the twins' faces, cataloging the undeniable similarities. His piercing blue eyes, his determined jaw, even the distinctive arch of his eyebrows. The little girl in the princess costume stepped forward boldly, looking up at the powerful billionaire with innocent curiosity. "Are you our daddy?" From the magazines. "Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's entire reality crumbles before their eyes? When the carefully constructed walls they've built around their heart collapse in an instant? If you've ever experienced a life-changing revelation that forced you to confront the consequences of your past choices, give this video a like. And if you believe that even the most guarded hearts deserve a second chance at love and family, subscribe to Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison for more stories that will touch your soul and perhaps change how you see the world. Emily Harris stood before her bathroom mirror, the embossed invitation trembling in her fingers as she read it for the 100th time. The annual Halloween Gala at Meridian Tower, the crown jewel of Anderson Enterprises, was the most exclusive event in the city. An invitation meant you were somebody. Or in Emily's case, it meant Thomas Anderson had finally found her. 5 years had passed since she'd walked away from their marriage, taking with her not just broken dreams but a secret that had grown into 2 perfect, innocent lives. Twins Ethan and Emma, now 4 years old, with their father's striking blue eyes and determined chin. "Mommy, are we really going to a castle?" Emma's voice pulled Emily from her thoughts as her daughter twirled in her princess costume, the sparkles catching the light from the overhead lamp. "It's not exactly a castle, sweetheart." Emily knelt down, adjusting the small tiara that kept slipping over Emma's forehead. "It's a very tall building where important people work. Where Daddy works," Ethan stated matter-of-factly, already so serious in his miniature night costume. "The man in the magazine." Emily's heart clenched painfully. She'd never hidden Thomas from them, not completely. They knew his face from business magazines, knew he was their father who wasn't ready to be a daddy yet. What they didn't know, what Thomas himself didn't know, was that tonight everything would change. The invitation hadn't been a peace offering. Emily recognized Thomas's tactics too well. This was meant to be her humiliation, a power play to remind her of everything she'd walked away from. The billionaire CEO showing his ex-wife how magnificently he'd thrived without her. Ms. Harris, her babysitter, Lucia, appeared in the doorway. "The car service you ordered is here." Emily took a deep breath, smoothing down her elaborate fairy queen costume. "Thank you, Lucia. We won't be late." "Are you sure about this?" Lucia asked quietly, her eyes concerned. "Taking the children to see him without warning?" Emily glanced at the twins, now excitedly peering out the window at the sleek black car waiting below. "He invited me to make a statement. I'm just making one of my own." What Thomas couldn't possibly anticipate was that she wasn't coming alone. The drive to Meridian Tower passed in a blur of city lights and the twins' excited chatter. Emily's mind drifted back to the day she'd discovered she was pregnant, just 3 weeks after leaving Thomas. She'd sat on the bathroom floor of her new apartment, staring at the positive test, tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of what lay ahead. Telling Thomas had seemed impossible then. He'd been so lost in his own darkness, so incapable of emotional connection. How could she burden him with children when he couldn't even care for himself? How could she subject innocent babies to the same emotional neglect Thomas had suffered at his own parents' hands? So she'd made the hardest choice of her life, to raise her children alone, to protect them from a father who might damage them the way his parents had damaged him. She'd moved to a different city, found work as an art teacher, and built a life centered entirely around Ethan and Emma. It wasn't until 6 months ago, when she'd seen an article about Thomas's new foundation for children affected by emotional neglect, that something had shifted inside her. The accompanying photo showed him sitting on the floor with a group of children, his usual stern expression replaced by something softer, more genuine. The article detailed his personal commitment to the cause, quoting him, "Some wounds are invisible, but cut deeper than any physical injury. Healing those wounds requires understanding, patience, and unconditional support." Those weren't the words of the man she'd left. Those were the words of someone who had faced his demons and begun to conquer them. Week after week, she'd followed news of his foundation, watching from afar as Thomas seemed to transform from the emotionally unavailable workaholic she'd known into someone capable of empathy and connection. When the invitation to his Halloween gala arrived, clearly meant as some sort of power play, she'd seen it instead as an opportunity. Perhaps, finally, he was ready to be the father her children deserved. The car pulled up to the gleaming tower, its upper floors glowing with the lights of the celebration. Emily gathered the twins close as they stepped out, their small faces tilted up in wonder at the massive building. "Remember what we practiced?" Emily whispered, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the doorman could hear it. "Best behavior tonight." "Yes, Mommy," they chorused, squeezing her hands tightly. The elevator ride to the penthouse ballroom felt eternal. Emily used the time to study her children's reflections in the mirrored walls, searching for courage in their innocent faces. They were the best of her and Thomas, Ethan with his thoughtful intensity, Emma with her fearless curiosity. They deserved to know their father, and he deserved to know them. Whatever happened next, she had to believe this was right. Meanwhile, Thomas Anderson surveyed his Halloween gala from the mezzanine overlooking the grand ballroom, satisfaction curling through him like smoke. At 38, he'd transformed Anderson Enterprises from a struggling family business into a global technology empire. The room below him glittered with the elite of society, all eager for his attention, his approval, his investment. "Quite the spectacle," remarked James Chun, his CFO and oldest friend, joining him at the railing. "Though I'm still questioning the wisdom of inviting Emily." Thomas's jaw tightened at the name. "It's been 5 years. I'm simply being magnanimous." "Magnanimous?" James repeated skeptically, swirling his champagne. "Nothing to do with showing off how well you've done without her?" "She left me, James, not the other way around." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. 5 years should have been enough to dull the edge of that particular wound. Yet here he was, still bleeding. "She had her reasons," James said quietly, his eyes knowing. "She wanted more than I could give." Thomas's voice hardened as he gripped the railing. "She knew who I was when she married me." The truth was more complicated, buried beneath layers of pride and pain. Emily had been the only person who'd ever seen through his carefully constructed facade, who'd recognized the wounded child still hiding behind the successful man. She tried to help him heal from his parents' emotional neglect, their constant criticism, their conditional love that had shaped him into someone always striving but never feeling worthy. And when he wouldn't let her in completely, when he retreated behind work and emotional walls rather than face his demons, she'd finally given up. Left him a note that still haunted him. "I can't keep loving someone who refuses to love himself." "Sir," his assistant's voice interrupted his thoughts. "She's here." Thomas straightened his custom-tailored vampire costume, the cape adding dramatic flair to his imposing figure. "Showtime." He descended the grand staircase with practiced grace, aware of all eyes turning to watch his entrance. This was his element, commanding attention, projecting power. The Halloween decorations, elegant and tasteful rather than garish, created the perfect backdrop for his dramatic costume. Gossamer cobwebs draped from crystal chandeliers, while carved pumpkins glowed with soft light on every table. Thomas scanned the crowd, searching for Emily. He'd imagined this moment for weeks, her arrival, alone and perhaps a bit intimidated by the opulence she'd walked away from. He'd planned to be gracious, to show her exactly what she'd given up when she'd left him, to prove that he'd thrived without her. The crowd parted, and suddenly there she was, as beautiful as he remembered, in an elaborate fairy queen costume that made her look ethereal, otherworldly. For a moment, he was transported back to their first meeting. She, a struggling art teacher volunteering at a charity auction. He, the enigmatic benefactor who'd bought her painting for an obscene amount and then asked for her number. But something was wrong. She wasn't alone. Two small figures flanked her, holding her hands tightly as they moved through the crowd. Children. Why would Emily bring children to this event? Thomas moved forward as if in a trance, the crowd melting away around him until he stood before her, close enough to see the nervous flutter of her pulse at her throat. "Emily," he said, his voice cooler than he intended. "I don't recall your invitation including guests." Emily lifted her chin slightly. "Hello, Thomas. You look well." "As do you," he replied automatically, his eyes dropping to the children beside her. They wore elaborate masks that obscured their features, the boy dressed as a knight, the girl as a princess. "And who might these little ones be?" Emily took a deep breath, then knelt down beside the children. "It's time," she whispered to them, "just like we practiced." With small, careful movements, both children reached up and removed their masks. Thomas found himself staring into two pairs of startlingly familiar blue eyes, his eyes, set in faces that could have been taken from his own childhood photographs. "Who are these children?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended as shock coursed through him. "And why do they look exactly like me?" The ballroom fell silent around them, the music suddenly seeming too loud in the tense atmosphere. Emily stood tall, her hands protectively on the children's shoulders. "They're your children, Thomas," she said clearly. "Ethan and Emma. They're 4 years old." Thomas staggered back slightly, his mind racing to calculate, to understand. 4 years old. 5 years since Emily left. She must have been pregnant when she walked away. His children. "That's impossible," he whispered. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. The resemblance was undeniable, not just his eyes, but the shape of their faces, the set of their jaws, even the way the boy stood slightly protectively beside his sister. Emma, always the braver of the two, stepped forward and looked up at him with unflinching curiosity. "Are you our daddy? From the magazines?" The simple question cut through his shock like a knife. Thomas found himself sinking to one knee, bringing himself to their level, his cape pooling around him on the marble floor. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "I believe I am." The whispers erupted around them immediately, the elite of society witnessing a moment none of them had expected. The unflappable Thomas Anderson brought to his knees by two small children no one knew existed. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," Emily suggested quietly, all too aware of the spectacle they were creating. Thomas nodded, still unable to take his eyes off the twins. "My office," he managed to say, rising to his feet. He turned to his assistant, who hovered nearby with wide eyes. "Rebecca, please escort Miss Harris and the children to my private office. I'll join them momentarily." As Emily and the twins followed the assistant toward the elevator, Thomas turned to find James at his elbow, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" his friend asked quietly. "I have children, James," Thomas said, the words sounding strange in his own ears. "Children I never knew existed." James squeezed his shoulder. "Go. Talk to her. Figure this out. I'll handle things here." Thomas nodded gratefully and moved to follow Emily and the twins, aware of every eye in the room tracking his movement, of the whispers that would soon become headlines. Billionaire CEO discovers secret twins at Halloween gala. For the first time in his adult life, Thomas Anderson didn't care what anyone thought. All that mattered were the two small children with his eyes and the woman who had kept them from him for 4 years. If you've ever had your world turned upside down in an instant, if you've ever faced a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about your life, hit that like button right now. And stay with me, because what happens next reveals how even the most guarded hearts can be transformed by the innocent love of a child. The private elevator whisked them up to the executive floor in tense silence. Emily could feel Thomas's eyes on her, burning with questions, but he remained silent until they reached his office, a vast space of glass and steel with panoramic views of the city skyline. "You can wait outside, Rebecca," Thomas instructed his assistant, who nodded and closed the door behind her, leaving the four of them alone. The twins immediately began exploring the unfamiliar space with childlike curiosity. Emma gravitated toward the wall of awards and photographs, while Ethan approached the large-scale model of Meridian Tower that dominated one corner of the office. 5 years, Thomas finally said, his voice low and controlled, though Emily could hear the fury simmering beneath the surface. 5 years of their lives gone. How could you keep this from me? Emily met his gaze steadily. You weren't ready to be a father, Thomas. Neither was I ready to co-parent with someone who couldn't even take care of himself. That wasn't your decision to make, he snapped, anger flashing in his eyes. They're my children too, wasn't it? Emily challenged, keeping her voice low so the twins wouldn't hear. You couldn't even commit to our marriage, Thomas. You were drowning in work, in your past, in everything except what was right in front of you. What would you have done if I told you I was pregnant? The question hung between them, honest and brutal. They both knew the answer. He would have panicked, retreated further, perhaps thrown money at the situation while emotionally checking out completely. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, disheveling his perfect appearance. I would have failed them, he admitted, the truth painful but necessary. Just like I failed you. His honesty surprised her. The Thomas she'd known would have defended himself, deflected, turned the blame back on her. This vulnerability was new. I didn't come here to hurt you, Emily said, her voice softening. I came because they deserved to know their father, and because... She hesitated. Because I thought maybe you were ready now. Thomas looked at his children. His children, touching his possessions with small, perfect hands, occasionally glancing at him with shy curiosity. Something shifted inside him, a tectonic movement of priorities and perspectives. What changed? He asked. Why believe I'm ready now when I wasn't then? Emily smiled sadly. I've been following your work with the Children's Foundation, the therapy programs you've funded for families affected by emotional neglect. It seemed personal. It was. After Emily left, Thomas had finally sought therapy himself, confronting the childhood wounds that had shaped him into a man incapable of true intimacy. The foundation had been born from his own healing journey, though few knew that truth. I started healing, he acknowledged. Too late for us, but... Daddy, Emma interrupted, tugging at his cape. Can we see the castle from up here? The word daddy hit him like a physical blow. He looked to Emily, who nodded encouragement. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, we can see the whole city. Thomas lifted Emma into his arms, carrying her to the floor-to-ceiling windows. See that building with the green roof? That's where they have the best ice cream in the city. Better than Gino's? Emma asked skeptically. Thomas glanced at Emily, confusion evident in his expression. Their favorite ice cream shop back home, she explained. I don't know Gino's, Thomas told Emma seriously. We'll have to try both and compare. Can we go now? Emma asked excitedly. Not tonight, sweetheart, Emily interjected gently. It's already past your bedtime. My turn, Ethan insisted, approaching Thomas with cautious interest. I want to see too. Thomas set Emma down and lifted Ethan, pointing out different landmarks. That's Central Park, and over there is the museum district. That's not the museum district, Ethan corrected him confidently. The museums are on the other side of the park. I read about it in my book about cities. Thomas laughed, genuinely delighted by his son's knowledge. You're absolutely right. I was testing you. Emily watched the scene unfold with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. This was what she'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect. Thomas embracing fatherhood not as another achievement to conquer but as a relationship to nurture. They have your stubbornness, she said when the twins were distracted by the model tower again. And your mind for details. They have your kindness, he replied, watching them with wonder. Your creativity. A comfortable silence fell between them. 5 years of separation bridged by these two small humans they'd created together. I don't expect forgiveness, Thomas said finally. But I want a chance to be their father. A good one. That's why we're here, Emily assured him. Not for revenge or reconciliation, but for them. Thomas nodded, understanding the boundaries she was setting. And us? What happens now? Emily considered the man before her. Not the wounded, closed-off husband she'd left, but someone who'd faced his demons and emerged stronger. Different. Now, she said carefully, we learn to be parents together. The rest, time will tell. If you've ever witnessed someone transform before your eyes, someone you thought incapable of change suddenly revealing depths you never imagined, hit that like button. And if you believe in second chances, in the power of growth and healing, subscribe to Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison for more stories that remind us it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Thomas's journey to this moment had been longer and more painful than anyone in his glittering social circle could imagine. Born to wealthy but emotionally distant parents, he'd grown up in a household where achievement was the only acceptable currency of love. His father, Richard Anderson, had built Anderson Technologies from nothing, sacrificing his family on the altar of success. Feelings are a luxury for those who don't have empires to build. His father had told him once, when 10-year-old Thomas had sought comfort after a school bully's taunts. Andersons don't cry, they succeed. His mother, Elizabeth, beautiful and remote as a distant star, had been no better. Her love came with conditions, perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect appearance. Any deviation was met with cool disappointment that cut deeper than any punishment. Thomas had learned early to bury his emotions, to present the perfect facade his parents demanded. He excelled academically, athletically, socially, becoming exactly what they wanted, while the real Thomas, the vulnerable boy with dreams and fears, remained locked away, even from himself. When his father died suddenly of a heart attack during Thomas's senior year at Harvard, he'd stepped into the role of CEO at 22, shouldering the weight of the struggling family business with grim determination. There was no time to grieve, no space to process the complicated emotions of losing a father he'd simultaneously loved, feared, and resented. By 30, he'd transformed Anderson Technologies into Anderson Enterprises, a global technology empire. By 33, he'd made his first billion. Success became his identity, work his refuge from the emptiness that haunted his quiet moments. Then came Emily, vibrant, authentic Emily, who'd crashed into his carefully controlled life like a meteor. He'd met her at a charity auction where her painting, a haunting depiction of a child reaching for a distant adult figure, had struck something deep within him. "What's it called?" he'd asked, approaching her after outbidding everyone in the room. "Invisible wounds," she'd replied, studying him with artist's eyes that seemed to see too much. "Some scars don't show on the surface." He'd asked her to dinner that night, expecting the usual deference he received from everyone in his orbit. Instead, Emily had challenged him, questioned him, laughed at his carefully constructed persona. "There's someone else in there," she'd said once, touching his chest lightly. "Someone hiding behind all this success and control. I'd like to meet him someday." Somehow, against all his instincts for self-preservation, he'd fallen in love with her. They'd married after a whirlwind courtship, and for a time, Thomas had believed he could have it all, the empire and the emotional connection he'd secretly craved his entire life. But old patterns proved difficult to break. When Emily pushed him to confront his past, to acknowledge the damage his parents had done, he'd retreated behind work and emotional walls. When she'd needed him most, during a miscarriage that devastated them both, he'd buried himself in a major acquisition, unable to face the pain, unable to comfort her when he couldn't even process his own grief. "I can't keep loving someone who refuses to love himself," her note had read the day she left. "I hope someday you find the courage to face your demons, Thomas. Until then, I need to save myself. Her departure had shattered something in him. For months, he'd thrown himself into work with even greater intensity, expanding the empire, accumulating more wealth, more power, more of everything that had never filled the void inside him. Until the night he'd found himself standing on the balcony of his penthouse, 40 floors above the city, wondering what it would feel like to fall. The emptiness had yawned before him, infinite and terrifying. The next morning, he'd called a therapist something he'd always dismissed as weakness. "I think I'm broken," he'd said simply, "and I don't know how to fix myself." The journey that followed had been the hardest work of his life. Harder than building his empire, harder than surviving Harvard at 18, harder than taking over a failing company at 22. Facing the wounded child within him, acknowledging the patterns that had shaped his adult life, learning to feel emotions he'd suppressed for decades, it had nearly broken him. But slowly, painfully, he'd begun to heal. The foundation had been born from that healing, his attempt to prevent other children from suffering as he had, to break the cycle of emotional neglect that created adults incapable of healthy connection. He'd thought of Emily often during those years of transformation, had even considered reaching out, but pride and shame had held him back. The invitation to the Halloween gala had been his compromise, a chance to see her, perhaps to show her he'd changed, without the vulnerability of a direct approach. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined she would bring his children he hadn't known existed. Children who now looked at him with innocent curiosity, unaware of the seismic shift they'd caused in his world. "Mr. Anderson?" Rebecca's voice came through the intercom. "The guests are asking about your return to the gala." Thomas glanced at Emily, then at the twins who were now sitting on his office floor, examining the tower model together. "Tell them I'll be down shortly," he replied, making a decision. "And Rebecca? Please have James make an announcement that I'll be introducing some very special guests." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Thomas, are you sure? This will be all over the media by morning." "Let it be," he said with newfound certainty. "I'm not hiding them, Emily. I'm not hiding anymore." He knelt down beside the twins. "Ethan, Emma, would you like to see the party downstairs? There's music and dancing and lots of Halloween decorations." "Can we have cake?" Emma asked, immediately practical in her priorities. Thomas laughed, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. "Definitely cake. And maybe ice cream too." "Will people stare at us?" Ethan asked, more perceptive than his years would suggest. Thomas considered his son thoughtfully. "Yes, they probably will, because they're surprised to meet you. But you don't have to worry. I'll be right there with you." "And Mommy too?" Emma asked, looking to Emily. "And Mommy too," Thomas confirmed, glancing at Emily with a question in his eyes. She nodded, her expression softening. "We'll all go together." As they prepared to return to the gala, Thomas found himself studying Emily's face, searching for traces of the woman he'd loved and lost. She'd changed too. There was a confidence about her now, a self-possession she'd lacked before. Motherhood had transformed her just as his own journey had transformed him. "Thank you," he said quietly as the twins put their masks back on, giggling at each other. "For bringing them tonight. For giving me a chance I don't deserve." "Everyone deserves a second chance, Thomas," Emily replied. "Even you, especially you." As they stepped into the elevator, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. Not the hollow satisfaction of another business victory or the temporary pleasure of an expensive acquisition, but something deeper and more profound. Hope. The elevator doors opened onto the ballroom, and Thomas Anderson stepped out with his children at his side and their mother beside him, ready to introduce his most important assets to the world. Not his business empire, but the family he never knew he had. The ballroom fell silent as Thomas stepped onto the small stage where the orchestra had been playing. With a gesture, he signaled for the music to stop, and all eyes turned to him. Emily stood to the side with the twins, her heart racing as she realized what was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hushed room. "Thank you all for coming to our annual Halloween gala. Tonight has become more significant than I could have ever anticipated. He paused, his gaze finding Emily and the twins in the crowd. Many of you know parts of my story, the business successes, the acquisitions, the growth of Anderson Enterprises. But there are chapters of my life that have remained private, some even unknown to me until tonight. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Thomas gestured for Emily and the twins to join him. With gentle encouragement, Emily guided Ethan and Emma forward, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares as they made their way to the stage. "I'd like to introduce you to Ethan and Emma," Thomas said, his voice softening as the twins stood beside him, small and vulnerable in the spotlight. "My children." The gasps were audible, phones immediately raised to capture the moment. Thomas placed a protective hand on each child's shoulder. "Until tonight, I didn't know they existed," he continued with remarkable candor. "Their mother, my ex-wife Emily, made a decision 5 years ago that I now understand was born of love and protection, not malice." Emily felt tears prick her eyes at his unexpected grace. This was not the Thomas she had left, the man who would have been consumed by anger and pride, who would have made her the villain in his narrative. "In recent years, I've spoken publicly about my foundation's work with children affected by emotional neglect," Thomas continued. "What I haven't shared is that this cause is deeply personal. I was one of those children, raised by parents who provided everything except what I needed most: unconditional love and acceptance." The ballroom was utterly silent now, the elite of society hanging on every word from a man many had known for years but never truly seen. "That legacy shaped me into someone incapable of true connection, someone who drove away the one person who saw through my walls." He glanced at Emily, his eyes conveying what words couldn't. "When Emily left me 5 years ago, she was unknowingly carrying our children. Tonight, they've come into my life like a miracle I never dared hope for." Emma, never one to stay quiet for long, tugged at Thomas's cape. "Daddy, you promised cake," she stage whispered, audible to everyone in the front rows. The tension broke as laughter rippled through the crowd. Thomas smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his face. "And cake you shall have," he promised her before addressing the crowd again. "Please enjoy the rest of the evening. My family and I have some catching up to do. If you've ever witnessed someone choose vulnerability over pride, authenticity over appearance, hit that like button right now. And if you believe that our greatest strength lies in our capacity to change, to grow beyond the limitations of our past, subscribe to Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity." As the gala continued around them, Thomas led Emily and the twins to a quiet corner where a small table had been prepared with an assortment of desserts. Emma's eyes widened at the display, while Ethan methodically examined each option before making his selection. "They're remarkable," Thomas said quietly to Emily as they watched the children. "You've done an amazing job with them." "It hasn't been easy," Emily admitted. "There were nights I questioned my decision not to tell you, especially when they started asking about their father." "What did you tell them?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Emily smiled sadly. "The truth, or a version of it. That you weren't ready to be a daddy yet, but that didn't mean you wouldn't be someday. And now," Thomas gestured to the children happily devouring chocolate cake. "What happens now, Emily?" It was the question that had haunted her since she'd decided to come tonight. What did she want? What was best for the twins? Could Thomas truly be the father they deserved? "Now we take it one day at a time," she said carefully. "They need stability, Thomas. They need to get to know you gradually, not in some grand gesture that fizzles out when the novelty wears off." Thomas nodded, accepting her caution. "I want to be part of their lives, Emily. Not just financially, but really present. I've missed 4 years. I don't want to miss another day." "And your work? The empire that's always come first?" It was a fair question, one that cut to the heart of why their marriage had failed. Thomas glanced around the opulent ballroom, at the powerful people who had always represented his definition of success. "None of it means anything without connection," he said finally. "I've built something impressive, yes, but these past years, I've been learning that achievement without love is hollow. I want different priorities now. Emily studied him, searching for signs of the old Thomas, the deflection, the charm that masked deeper issues, the promises made but never kept. Instead, she found steady sincerity in his gaze, a groundedness she'd never seen before. "We live in Boston now," she said, testing him. "My teaching position is there, and the twins are settled in their preschool." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Anderson Enterprises has offices in Boston. I can work from there 3 days a week, commute back here when necessary." Just like that. Emily couldn't hide her surprise. "You'd reorganize your entire life? For them?" Thomas looked at the twins, now engaged in an animated conversation with an elderly couple who had stopped to admire their costumes. Without question, the conviction in his voice stirred something in Emily she'd thought long dead. Not love. Not yet, but perhaps the seedling of trust. "One step at a time," she reiterated. "Starting with regular visits, getting to know each other. They need consistency, Thomas. Not grand gestures followed by disappearances." "I understand," he said solemnly. "I won't let them down, Emily. Or you." As the evening drew to a close, the twins' energy finally began to wane. Emma leaned against Thomas's leg, while Ethan's eyelids drooped despite his determined efforts to stay awake. "We should get them back to the hotel," Emily said, gathering her things. "It's way past their bedtime." "Let me drive you," Thomas offered. "My car is downstairs." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Thomas lifted Emma, who immediately nestled against his shoulder as if she'd been doing it her whole life. The simple gesture, his daughter's complete trust, her small body relaxed against his, overwhelmed him with emotion he couldn't name. "I can carry Ethan," Emily said, reaching for her son, but Thomas shook his head. "I've got them both," he insisted, carefully lifting Ethan with his other arm. The boy mumbled something incoherent before settling against Thomas's chest, mirroring his sister. As they made their way through the thinning crowd, Emily walking beside Thomas carrying both sleeping children, she was struck by how right it looked, how natural. This man who had once seemed incapable of genuine connection now cradled his children with such tenderness it made her heart ache. In the quiet of the car, with the twins securely buckled in the back seat and drifting deeper into sleep, Thomas finally asked the question that had been haunting him all evening. "Why did you really come tonight, Emily? You could have contacted me privately, arranged a meeting. Why choose such a public moment?" Emily gazed out at the city lights passing by before answering. "I needed to see who you've become, Thomas. Not in a controlled environment where you could present your best self, but in the world where you're most comfortable. I needed to see if the man I've been reading about in those Foundation articles was real or just another carefully crafted image." "And," Thomas asked softly, "what did you see?" "I saw a man humble enough to kneel before his children," Emily replied. "A man willing to be vulnerable in front of the very people he once lived to impress. That's not the Thomas the first left 5 years ago." They pulled up to the hotel, the conversation pausing as they carefully transferred the sleeping twins from the car to their suite. Together, they removed small shoes and costumes, tucking Ethan and Emma into the hotel beds without waking them. Standing in the doorway of the children's room, watching their peaceful sleep, Thomas felt a completeness he'd never known before. "They'll have questions in the morning," Emily said quietly. "About you, about us, about what happens next. I'll be here to answer them," Thomas promised. "If that's okay with you." Emily nodded, surprising herself with how much she wanted that. "Breakfast at 8? They're early risers." "I'll be here at 7:30, Thomas said, his voice firm with commitment. "With donuts. Kids like donuts, right?" Emily laughed softly. These two would trade their kingdom for a good chocolate donut. As Thomas prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you, Emily. Not just for tonight, but for them. For raising them to be so perfect." "They're not perfect," Emily corrected gently. "They're real children with tantrums and fears and stubborn streaks a mile wide. But they're ours, Thomas. And they deserve parents who can be real with them too." I'm learning, he promised. Every day, I'm learning. After he left, Emily stood at the window watching as his car pulled away from the hotel. The future stretched before them, uncharted and uncertain. But for the first time in years, she felt something like peace about the path ahead. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is give someone the chance to become the person they were always meant to be. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that transformation is possible even after years of pain and separation, share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. And join me next time on Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison, where we'll explore another journey of love, loss, and the courage to begin again.